For the most features, though, is if you go to surface.giza.ws, a gentleman took a painstaking task of measuring all the steps of the pyramid, and you'll see that it has a sweeping pattern that on its surface quarantines, well, basically static electricity basically falls upon there. Nature does that by itself. And the way it's engineered, it pushes the static electricity to the top of the structure. Now, back in its heyday, it didn't have a top. In fact, to alleviate that annoying buildup of static electricity today, we put a nice little antenna up there so it vents that static electricity off. But we're going to get to that in a second. They also went ahead and at the 35th level, they put a break that would quarantine the static electricity from going to ground. So it would basically create a big Van de Graaff generator shell out there in the middle of the desert. So we take that back off, and in a couple of weeks, we'll have a bunch of static electricity on there. Now this, I'm sure you've looked at your air vents and stuff like that, sun coming through your window, and you notice how it gives a little ripply effect. That would give your ripply effect people talk about, would also account for why in the 1800s people could go up there and their hair would stand on end and they would fill their Leyden jars and do all the other stuff. Yeah, no. So now you know what the structure on its exterior is doing. Now let's talk about the interior. Back in the day, when it was functioning, you would have the water level between the 35th level and just above the entrance. That would be, I'm going to say a moat around it, but I really think that the entire structure was built up so that it was just a pool around it. But either way, that's the water level. Now from there, it would saturate the entire system. The whole subsystem would be saturated. The up to ground level where there's the grotto would be saturated. Up to the, well, it would saturate it up to just below the Queen's Chamber there. So let's make this being the Grand Gallery, yay, and we'll get up to the top here in a second. But the water level would be such that, well, you notice how in the Queen's Chamber there's a step that comes down before it gets there? It would be just enough so that there would be a break in the water. So the water, as it sat by default, would not be able to get into Queen's Chamber. So now what does occur, though, is down here in the subterranean chamber, the only spot where it will touch earth, everything else is a limestone bath, and up here in the grotto, the only other spot where it touches earth, you're going to get a reaction between these two locations. Nature does that, you know, what was it, 100 volts or every 10 feet or so? But, you know, we ignore these little facts of nature. You're going to get a separation there of the voltages, and you're going to get a separation of the water, hydrogen and oxygen, into its respective gases. The oxygen is basically a waste product. It vents out of the system. But as it vents out of the system, it has to fight its way through the rocks that were piled there, you know, the loosely fitting rocks to hide the entrance. And it creates an air bubble pocket, in this case, oxygen. And that quarantines the system inside from nature outside. That's part of what it does. Also on its way out, it does some other stuff down here, but I get into that into the System Down Under videos. You're welcome to go into that, but we're just looking at the main picture here. The hydrogen, basically, it comes out of the grotto, which is why it's shaped funny like that. It's vented out of the holes that are drilled in the southern wall that were there to hide the scrolls. And it's piped up to the top part of the king's chamber where they find the seeds and the shells and the dust that they can't account for. And I'm going to tell you that was impurities in the water brought up with the gas, you know, just brought up with the gas, because they didn't have little filters or stockings there to separate out all those little impurities, so they came up with the gas. Anyway, comes up with the gas, and because it's acting like it would if you fill anything else, the hydrogen gas is going to work its way down. Now, when you look at pictures and video of the structure, especially back in the olden days, That gas comes down. Well, we can go, I go into the exact details in the upper system videos I have and my major things, and I'm trying to make this quick. So that gas is combined with the one and only outlet, the one and only conduit that breaches the structure, would bring in normal everyday air, which is oxygen, nitrogen, and primarily carbon dioxide, and a couple other trace elements. But it's the oxygen, which is the gas that we're going to play with here. It's going to get burnt back together because of the static electricity out here we talked about. A little spark is going to happen every now and then. That is going to cause an explosion, which then, because of the way the system is set up, it maintains it at a nice little dull roar, and that's going to be water. And that water also creates steam. That steam is going to basically fill the rest of the system, and it's going to collect the static electricity that we already talked about, which is collecting on the outside of the structure. That steam is then basically going to cool and condense, and just like raindrops, it's going to come down into the system. The way that the whole grand gallery has its vaulted ceilings with the little lips there, you're going to get lots of little raindrops. Those raindrops are going to be falling on both sides of the channel, basically pulling the static electricity down into the system. Now the static electricity, the raindrops are going to come down until it meets the water, and it's going to run down the side and fill the pool over here. Now it also will spill down and go down to the grand gallery, down into the well shaft, and repeat the whole system all over again. This will eventually fill up with water if it hadn't been already, but and because of the way that this is creating a higher pressure because of the oxygen escaping, having to fight through the rocks, it's actually going to bring up the water level a tiny bit, but it's not actually going to be higher than the water level here. We can go into how and why, but when it's running through the rocks, it actually brings the water level down, but the pressure brings it up a little bit, but still separates it from the system until this depresses the water, which then brings it up to, and you can see the watermark, which is just above the first step in the niche, the tail of the niche. It's got 3 different layers there. Each one of those layers, that goes more into the communication. We'll get into that later, but now we're just going over the system. The static electricity basically quarantines itself and collects within the Queen's chamber. And once within the Queen's chamber, it really wants a place to go. You give it 2 options. You give it option 1 and option 2. And because we know because of the nice crack in the wall, which is what led us to drill through the wall to find the conduit, that was the path of least resistance. And nature always goes with the path of least resistance. Now from there, we actually get into the next set of structures on the plateau, and we learn what they did with the energy, electricity, whatever you want to call it. But that's basically how the Giza pyramid system worked. This whole structure here was quarantined from the outside world by the oxygen bubble, and the static electricity is brought down through the water molecules, precipitation, raindrops falling down the system. Each time one of those falls, it brings a little bit of static electricity down into the system with it. Yes, you can call it a water pump because they pumped the hydrogen. Nature did that by itself. It's a gas. It goes up, and then when it joined back together with the oxygen, it came back down. So you want to call it a water pump? Hey, great, call it a water pump. I call it a really cool, ingenuitive idea. And, well, I'd like to recreate it and see what else this little puppy does, because there's a lot more to the story. You got the whole rest of the structures on the plateau, and I go into them in great detail on my website. You're welcome to join, call, Skype, whatever you want. Thank you. Have a nice day.